Every story that changes a life begins with a moment that seems insignificant. On a misty early spring afternoon in Seattle, Landon Hale, the young CEO of Helix Corp, sat inside his glass-walled office on the 47th floor, overlooking the entire city. At 36, he was already one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America, the man behind some of the most advanced artificial intelligence software in the medical field. But behind all the glory, Landon lived a lonely life. No close friends, no lover, only work, and emptiness. He had once loved, once trusted, until the woman he thought was his whole world walked away right before his graduation at Stanford. From that moment, Landon locked his heart-building Helix core like a fortress of steel between himself and the world of emotions. Everything would have remained the same, if not for one phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Hale, I have extremely important news from Zurich." It was the voice of Sienna, his personal assistant and keeper of his packed schedule, coming through the Bluetooth speaker. "Go ahead," Landon replied, eyes still scanning a financial report. "Mr. Morten Voss, our strategic Swiss investor, has agreed to meet with you privately next week in Seattle. But he has one special condition: you must bring a girlfriend to dinner." Landon froze. A girlfriend. Yes, Mr. Voss is a traditional man. He believes a businessman is truly worth investing in only if he can balance work and his personal life. This condition is non-negotiable. For a long moment, Landon sat still. That dinner wasn't just a meeting. It was the chance to unlock a funding chain worth hundreds of millions for Helix Corp. But there was one major problem: he had no one to bring. Loneliness had always been a choice, until now, when it had suddenly become a weakness. "I don't date, and I'm not about to start just for a dinner party," Landon said slowly. Sienna lowered her voice. "I know, but I also know you never let emotions get in the way of reason. This is the biggest opportunity of the year, and if what he wants is the image of stability and happiness, then create it." Her words were like a key turning in a lock no one had expected. Landon gave a faint wry smile, half defiance, half acceptance. "Find me someone. A woman who can handle dinner with one of Europe's toughest men. Proper manners, intelligent, knows how to hold a conversation. And," he hesitated, "don't make her act fake." "I'll get right on it," Sienna answered briskly, then ended the call. As soon as the line went dead, Landon rose from his chair and walked to the massive glass wall, gazing out over the city as the evening lights flickered on. The reflections sparkled across the window, like fragments of destiny falling into place. He had no idea that this small request, just one evening of pretending, would forever alter the course of his life. But fate always finds its own way to teach a man how to love again. 3 days later, Landon sat in his office with a stack of carefully selected candidate profiles Sienna had put together. The folders piled high across his desk looked less like resumes and more like casting sheets, complete with photos, education, social background, and crisis handling skills. All of them were beautiful, polished women, so flawless they blurred into one another. The first interview began promptly at 9 a.m. The woman was a communications coach. Graceful smile, eloquent speech, but every gesture was calculated. The next was a journalist who had appeared on TV, smart but cold. The third, far too eager, chattering non-stop like she was auditioning for a reality show. After nearly 10 profiles, Landon left his office exhausted and disappointed. He walked down Helix Corp's sleek corridor, hands shoved in his pockets, then rode the elevator down. Outside, a light drizzle swept across Seattle's gray sky. He needed fresh air. Not far from the company stood a small corner cafe, Brew and Bloom, a place Landon occasionally stopped in the mornings because the coffee there never failed him. Today was no different. The air inside carried the warm aroma of espresso and almond pastries. But this time, something at the counter caught his eye. A young woman wearing a caramel apron was gently wiping down the bar. Her hair was tied neatly back, her eyes bright, her smile soft. Though the cafe was buzzing with customers, she moved with an astonishing calm, soothing a difficult patron handling a faulty espresso machine and helping a junior barista who had just spilled a tray of water. She wasn't just pleasant, she radiated a quiet, natural warmth. From a corner seat, Landon watched her, and then he stood and walked to the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his tone casual but direct. You're Grace, right? The young woman looked up, narrowing her eyes in surprise. Yes. Can I help you? Landon gave a small nod. I know this is going to sound strange, but I have a job offer, an unusual one, and you're the only person I can think of right now. Grace let out a light laugh as though he were joking. If you're looking for someone to make coffee at your house, I only work here. Not coffee, Landon said, his expression serious. I need someone to pretend to be my girlfriend, just for one night at a business dinner, a role to play. I'll pay you generously. Grace fell silent, studying the man in front of her. Clearly he wasn't joking, and there was nothing shady in his tone. She had heard of eccentric wealthy men, but this one, strange as he was, gave off an odd sense of trustworthiness. Why me, she asked. Because you're calm, graceful good, with people. And real, Landon replied without hesitation. Grace chuckled. You don't even know who I am, do you? No, he admitted. Then why assume I'm right for this? Instinct, and I trust my instincts. The silence stretched, feeling longer than it was. Grace was barely keeping up with rent and her mother's medical bills. She wasn't used to social performances, but somehow she didn't feel afraid, because he didn't seem like someone trying to take advantage of her. How long, she finally asked, raising an eyebrow. A week of preparation. Then one evening, I'll handle all the wardrobe styling, even social training, if needed. She took a sip of water, then gave a slight nod. All right, but I have a condition too. Name it. Don't treat me like an object. I'll help you, but I'm still me. For the first time in months, Landon smiled. Deal. They shook hands across the warm, bustling cafe, and in that instant, both their lives veered onto an entirely new path. As for Grace, she never imagined that one afternoon, Lade would be the doorway into a world she had never even dared to dream of. The very next morning, Grace was escorted by Sienna, Landon's assistant, into a sleek modern office tower in downtown Seattle. She had never set foot in such a polished professional space before. Every step echoed on the marble floors. Every person passing by radiated purpose and poise. Inside a private conference room on the 30th floor, Landon was waiting for her with a cappuccino and a thick folder. Good morning, he said, his voice softer than before. I wasn't sure if you take milk or straight black, so I guessed. Grace smiled, lifting the cup. I think you guessed right. Landon gestured toward the chair. Today we begin training. I'll brief you on the company, Mr. Morton Voss, and the dinner ahead. Later this afternoon, you'll meet with a stylist and a social etiquette coach. Grace swallowed hard. It all sounded more like rehearsal for a political campaign than a dinner date. Feels like you're preparing to run for president. For someone like Morton Voss, it's not that different, Landon replied. He's the kind of man who can read a person's emotions with a handshake. Every tiny detail creates a lasting impression. Grace opened the folder, skimming through. But what caught her attention more was the flicker in Landon's eyes. For a fleeting moment, she caught a glimpse of something fragile beneath the armor of precision and control. Do you usually do things like this? She asked, not just curious, but testing him. No, he answered without hesitation. In fact, I've never done anything like this before. Then, why trust me? His gaze locked with hers, steady and serious. Because you don't try to be perfect. And that's what makes you stand out. That afternoon, they visited an upscale fashion boutique where Grace was treated like a VIP. The stylist, Marina, a sharp-eyed Italian woman with quick hands, assessed Grace's figure and aura in an instant. We'll find something that says two things, confidence and grace, Marina declared, flipping through hangers. After nearly 2 hours, they settled on an emerald velvet gown, sleek at the waist, modest but alluring, not flashy but impossible to overlook. I don't think I can pull this off, Grace murmured, staring at the mirror with quiet doubt. But you already do, Landon said softly, almost in a whisper. This doesn't change you. It just lets people see what's already there. Grace's lips curved into a small smile. For the first time that day, she felt worthy. The days that followed felt like a movie on slow rewind. Each late afternoon after finishing at Helix Core, Landon would pick Grace up from the cafe where she still worked mornings. Together, they would head to a training center, mock dinner parties, cocktail lounges, even elevator encounters designed to mimic high society interactions, where seconds of small talk could mean everything. At first, it was exactly what he had planned, coaching on gestures, refining her presence, practicing conversation. But very quickly, training became nothing more than an excuse. Something else, something deeper, was happening between them. Grace wasn't just learning how to stand beside Landon as a contract girlfriend. She was starting to see the man beneath the polished CEO, the one who spoke in precise tones, as if every sentence were $1 million pitch. Slowly, piece by piece, he revealed the parts of himself that no one else had seen, perhaps even the parts he had hidden from himself. On quiet late nights, sitting together on his balcony, with the Seattle wind humming low, Landon shared stories of his childhood in the suburbs of Phoenix. Long summer afternoons spent with his father, Harvey Hale, fixing the old air conditioner in their garage. His father wasn't a wealthy man, but careful, thoughtful, reading the Sunday paper each week and circling the small jokes to read aloud to his son. They had been close. But everything changed when Harvey died suddenly of a stroke. Landon was only 19 in his first year of college. That loss tore his family apart. His mother, Marjorie Hale, an introverted woman who never found ease with emotions, withdrew further into herself. She lived on in their spacious house, but the meals were silent, holidays empty with vacant chairs. Landon had tried to reach out, but every call ended in brief pleasantries. Eventually, he learned that sometimes loneliness doesn't come from people leaving, but from not knowing how to let anyone stay. I'm afraid one day, Landon whispered to Grace, I'll end up like her, living in a beautiful house with everything I could want, except someone real beside me. Grace froze, struck silent. For the first time, she saw not a powerful man, but a boy still searching for a place to belong. And Landon in turn began to see Grace differently. She wasn't just playing a part. She carried a quiet strength, a way of making others feel seen and heard. Without judgment, without effort, she made him feel lighter. One evening during a cocktail simulation, Grace accidentally spilled red wine across a white tablecloth. She gasped, blushing furiously. But before she could apologize, Landon laughed. A genuine laugh that surprised even himself. Do you know, he said, handing her a napkin wine on white linen looks like a disaster. But sometimes it's how we remember what's real. The things that matter are never perfect. Grace stared at him, dazed. For the first time, his smile wasn't guarded. That night, instead of going home, he invited her to walk by Union Lake. Small boats drifted across the water, the city lights dancing gold in their reflections. They said little, their footsteps tapping quietly against the stone path. Do you ever wish for something else? Grace finally asked. Wish? He arched a brow. Yes, a dream beyond your career. He chuckled faintly. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect. Not to build towers, but to design libraries. Warm, quiet places where people could read and maybe find themselves. Grace smiled. And now you build AI software. Life never follows the blueprints we draw. But you know what? He paused, turning to her. Since meeting you, I've started to believe that some old dreams can come back in new ways. On another night they had dinner together in a conference room, Landon had turned into a makeshift kitchen. He cooked pasta carbonara, a recipe he'd learned from YouTube. Doesn't it get lonely living like this? Grace asked as she twirled her fork. Landon went quiet for a beat. Yes, but loneliness becomes so familiar you stop fearing it. Like an old coat, not pretty, but warm. Grace rested her chin on her hand, eyes soft. Maybe it's time for a new coat. He looked at her, and in the glimmer of light, there was something new in his gaze. Something fragile, something hopeful. One evening, as Grace studied the AI prototype on his screen, she shook her head in wonder. This feels more like magic than machinery. Maybe, Landon said, smiling. But sometimes the most magical thing isn't inside a chip. It's when two people actually stop and really look at each other. Grace turned toward him. And in that suspended moment, under the dim glow of data rings spinning across the screen, she saw not a CEO, not her employer, but a man opening his heart. Have you ever thought of walking away from it all? Starting over? She asked quietly. He was silent for a long time, then turned to the city sparkling outside. I have, but I never knew what starting over meant. Until I met you. Grace didn't answer. She just looked at him. For a long, long time. Not because his words were sweet, but because she knew they were true. And the truth made her heart tremble. That night when she left, Landon walked her to the elevator. He only said goodnight like always. But when the doors closed, Grace stood there feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She wasn't sure anymore if she was still just acting, and that uncertainty terrified her. Because in this play, they were staging the line between pretending to love and wanting it to be real was becoming dangerously thin. The evening of the long-awaited dinner finally arrived. Seattle glowed unusually bright that night. Golden streetlights shimmered across the rain-slick pavement, stretching into luminous ribbons as though painted by an absent-minded artist. Inside a luxury penthouse overlooking Union Lake, Landon stood before a mirror, adjusting a deep blue tie. The color sienna insisted would soften his otherwise severe presence. In the adjoining room, Grace was surrounded by stylists and makeup artists. She wore the emerald velvet gown they had chosen days earlier, its cut refined, modest, yet alluring, accentuating her natural elegance. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, styled with classic grace, just enough to command attention. When the door opened and she stepped out, Landon turned. For a split second, his breath caught. Not because of the dress, but because of Grace herself. In every moment he had seen her before, she had been lovely. But tonight, she radiated something else entirely. Not just beauty, but confidence, poise, a quiet brilliance that made it seem she had always belonged in this world. "You," he stammered, "you make everything else fade away." Grace tilted her head with a gentle smile. "You don't look too bad yourself." Together, they stepped into a sleek black limousine, sliding onto the leather seats side by side as the car glided through the heart of the city. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was like background music, each heartbeat amplified beneath the blur of streetlights. La Lumiere, the restaurant chosen for the evening, was one of Seattle's most opulent. Marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers of dripping crystal, and candlelight shimmered across every surface as though the entire room were enchanted. They were ushered into a private dining room where Morton Voss awaited them. He was a distinguished man, silver-haired with a distinctly European bearing. Beside him sat his wife Annalise, a woman with sharp eyes and an artistic air. "Mr. Hale's such a pleasure," Morton said, warmly clasping Landon's hand. Then he turned to Grace, "And this must be the remarkable young lady." Grace stepped forward, offering her hand with a poised smile. "Grace Callahan, it's an honor to meet you both." From the very first moments, Grace surprised everyone at the table, not with her gown, but with her wit and her effortless charm. When Annalise asked about her work, Grace didn't pretend to be a writer, an investor, or anything polished. She told the truth. She had been a barista, and now she was learning about technology so she could support Landon. "I don't know much about software," she admitted, her tone sincere. "But I believe that if technology begins from the heart, it will always create something good." Morton nodded thoughtfully. A simple statement, yet deeply profound. Across the table, Landon's gaze softened. He hadn't given her a script, and the miracle was, she didn't need one. Grace was simply herself, and that was enough. Dinner flowed easily, the conversation weaving from Helix Core's future and medical AI to Morton's youthful dreams of becoming an artist, before turning to finance. Laughter and stories filled the evening. Then Annalise leaned forward with a curious smile. "Tell me, how did the two of you meet?" Grace turned toward Landon, mischief glimmering in her brown eyes. "A latte." Landon chuckled genuinely. "And a ridiculous proposal. He was a regular at the cafe where I worked." Grace continued. "One rainy day he looked tired but still managed to politely ask my name. A week later, he came back and asked if I'd be his girlfriend for a dinner." Annalise laughed out loud. "That sounds straight out of a Hollywood romance." "Maybe so," Grace winked, "but I still don't know how it ends." At the close of the evening, Morton raised his glass. "Landon, I don't just invest in products. I invest in people. And tonight I've seen a leader who knows how to love. That is rare in your industry." Landon thanked him politely, but his eyes never left Grace. On the drive back, they sat quietly, Seattle's skyline glittering beyond the tinted windows. Inside the limousine, though the world was reduced to only the two of them. "You were even better than I imagined," Landon finally said. Grace tilted her head. "And you didn't make a mess of things the way I feared." They both laughed softly, but then the laughter faded into silence again. this time heavy with something unspoken. I used to think, Landon said quietly, that a night like this was just a strategy. But now, I wish it weren't only a performance. Grace turned her face to the window, as if to hide the sudden break inside her chest. She didn't reply, but when he gently reached for her hand, unscripted, unrehearsed, she didn't pull away. No more words were needed. Because both of them knew, though, it all began as a game. What they felt tonight was real. After a dinner that exceeded every expectation, with Morton Voss's praises and Annalise's approving smiles, Landon and Grace returned home no longer just two people pretending. Neither said it out loud, but both knew something had shifted. The next morning, instead of diving into his relentless schedule, Landon did something unprecedented. He canceled a Monday meeting. "Are you sick?" Sienna asked suspiciously, staring at the sudden blank space in his calendar. "No, I just decided to slow down for once." And slowing down meant one thing: going to Brew and Bloom, ordering a latte, and waiting for Grace to finish her morning shift. When she walked out in her familiar caramel apron, hair tied up as always, Landon stood as though he'd been waiting his whole life. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Grace asked, startled. Starting again where everything began, he replied with a quiet smile, "If you're free, want to take a walk." She hesitated only a moment, then nodded. They strolled along Seattle's harbor, where the air was cool and the water lapped gently against the docks. No chandeliers, no rehearsed scenarios. Just two ordinary people trying to understand what was happening in their hearts. "Do you think we've strayed too far from our original deal?" Landon asked, eyes on the horizon. "Yes," Grace answered without hesitation. "But I don't feel like going back." Landon stopped walking. "Neither do I." It wasn't a confession, but it was truer than any declaration of love. In the days that followed, they still met often, but not under the guise of training. Landon began showing up at the cafe more frequently, sometimes to slip her a book he thought she might like, sometimes to invite her to dinner after her shift. Grace, in turn, became a familiar presence at Helix Core, not as a pretend girlfriend, but as someone who truly belonged in Landon's life. They shared the little things. Grace took him to her favorite used bookstore, the one where she used to spend hours reading secretly because she couldn't afford the books. Landon brought her into his tech lab, showing her the emotion-reading software he'd designed for patients. One afternoon, sitting together in an empty conference room, Grace handed him a thin notebook containing a short novel she had once begun but never finished. Landon read with quiet intensity, then looked up. "You should finish this." "I don't think anyone would want to read it," she said, embarrassed. "I would," he said, placing his hand over hers. "And you need to believe that your voice deserves to be heard." That night, they cooked together in Landon's penthouse kitchen, a first for them both. Grace was clearly the more skilled cook, while Landon, despite his best efforts, splattered sauce across his shirt. "You might be a tech genius, but you're hopeless at frying an egg," Grace teased. "Only because I don't have the right teacher," Landon countered, flicking a spoonful of flour onto her nose. They burst into laughter, the kitchen warm with the kind of joy that felt like a family. Something peaceful, something simple, was quietly taking root. But one quiet evening, as they read side by side, Grace finally voiced the fear pressing on her heart. "Landon, if tomorrow everything went back to the way it was, no dinner, no need for a girlfriend, then what would I be in your life?" The question made him freeze. "What are you afraid of?" he asked gently. "That I was only ever a temporary role. That once everything is settled, you'll return to a world I never really belonged to." Landon looked at her for a long time. "Grace, you came into my life as someone I hired. But with every hour, every day, you've made me want to erase that deal. You're not an addition to my strategy anymore. You're the one thing I don't want to lose." She didn't reply. She only nodded softly, as if admitting her heart had been thinking the same all along. A week later, Helix Core officially signed a strategic deal with Morton Voss's firm. A massive victory. Headlines praised Landon as the leader who balances intellect with heart. But for Landon, the greater triumph wasn't in the papers. It was the quiet new life blossoming each day beside the woman he had never dared dream would enter his world. And for Grace, the success wasn't in a flawless dinner party, but in the answer to a question she had once asked herself: could love born from a lie ever become real? In this case, the answer was yes. Seattle's April skies held less rain than usual that year, as if even the weather was quietly blessing something beautiful that had begun to grow. While the entire Helix Core team was still celebrating their historic deal with Morton Voss, Landon was struggling with the one thing he could neither analyze with data nor control with code: his own emotions. During meetings, his thoughts would drift, his eyes wandering unconsciously toward the windows, where sunlight shimmered against the clouds. Before, his rare free hours had been consumed by books, emails, and research drafts. Now, every silence was filled by thoughts of one person: Grace. She had become so intertwined with his life that without her, everything felt too empty again. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked nervously, holding the gala invitation in her hands. "I've never been more sure," Landon replied. It was the annual gala of the Medical Technology Alliance, the pinnacle event where the wealthiest, the brightest, and the most exacting minds of the industry gathered. For the first time, Landon wouldn't be attending alone. And for the first time, it wasn't about strategy or appearances. He wanted Grace there simply because she made him feel whole. That evening, Grace emerged from the dressing room like a vision. She wore a deep sapphire satin gown that draped elegantly over her slender frame, her hair styled in loose curls, her eyes glowing under the chandelier light. She was no longer the barista from Brew and Bloom, no longer the contract girlfriend. Tonight she was a woman who belonged without question. Landon, in a sharp black tuxedo, went still when he saw her. "Eves des torses, bindle. You'll be late if you keep staring," Grace teased softly, her eyes sparkling. "Then being late is worth it," he murmured, offering his hand. "Will you walk with me?" The gala was held at the Grand Fairmont Hotel, where every light seemed to have its purpose. From the moment Landon and Grace entered the ballroom, they drew eyes. Whispers stirred, assessments made. But soon those looks of speculation turned into quiet admiration. Grace carried herself as though she had belonged in that world all along. Graceful, charming, never trying too hard. She introduced herself simply as a book lover without a degree, and even the sternest executives laughed. But it wasn't her words alone. It was the way she looked at Landon while he spoke about Helix Core's vision, sincere, proud, and without pretense. That was what convinced people this wasn't a performance. It was truth. When the orchestra shifted into classic love songs and the dance floor glowed beneath softened lights, Landon extended his hand. "Dance with me." "I'm not good at it," Grace whispered, embarrassed. "You don't have to be, just let me lead." Under the golden lights, surrounded by glittering gowns and polished tuxedos, they swayed slowly, silently, lost in each other. For a moment, it felt as if the world had vanished, leaving only two hearts moving in time. "Grace," Landon whispered, his voice low and unsteady. "This may have started as a plan, but to me, now it's real." Her chest tightened. "I used to think no one could step into my world," he continued, his eyes searching hers. "But you walked in without knocking. You've made everything warmer, lighter, meaningful. You make me want to be a better man." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "I know you're afraid," he said, his voice trembling. "So am I. But if even the smallest part of you believes this is real, if even a fraction of you wants to take it further, please, don't walk away." Grace placed her hand over his chest, feeling his heart race. "I don't want to walk away. I'm only afraid that I'm not good enough for your world." "No," Landon shook his head firmly. "It's my world that's never been enough for someone like you." Her lips trembled into a smile as she rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. The music, the chandeliers, the crowd, all faded into nothing. They no longer needed a script. They had left the act behind, and they had found themselves. That night after the gala, they didn't return to the penthouse. Instead, the car stopped at the same harbor where they had once walked together for the first time, where the wind still blew and the waves still brushed the shore, and distant lights flickered like stars. Landon held her hand tightly without a word. Grace stayed silent too, but she knew. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in that dance, and from that moment, they weren't pretending anymore. They were in love, truly in love. June arrived carrying warm sunlight and magnolia blossoms blooming white across the gardens along Green Lake. Seattle was no longer its usual gray drizzle. It seemed to be celebrating too quietly, sharing in the new life Landon and Grace were building together. They didn't announce their relationship in the press. They didn't stand before cameras declaring love has begun. But anyone who saw the way they looked at each other, the way their hands brushed without thought, knew the truth. Something real was flourishing. At that time, Grace's mother, Evelyn, was still undergoing treatment for chronic heart disease at a community medical center on the outskirts of Seattle. The costs weren't astronomical, but for Grace, who had stretched every dollar just to keep going, they were still a heavy burden. Few knew that, beyond her barista shifts at Brew and Bloom, Grace also juggled 2 other jobs, part-time data entry for a logistics company and tutoring literature online at night. She lived in a constant cycle of morning rushes, late nights, and stolen naps between buses. So when she thought about quitting her cafe job, the most time-consuming of the 3, her chest tightened. Quitting meant losing income. And though Landon had offered more than once to cover her mother's hospital bills, Grace hesitated. Not out of pride, but because she wanted to be certain if she pursued her writing, it was by her own choice. Not because she had been rescued. She kept up her data entry 2 mornings a week and tutoring on weekends, clinging to a sense of financial control and responsibility for her mother. But in the hours once spent brewing lattes, she now sat in front of her laptop, writing. Writing with her real heartbeat on the page. Leaving Brew and Bloom wasn't surrender. It was courage. A quiet step toward a new life on her own terms. She didn't plan on telling Landon. He had already given so much, from social coaching to looking after her when she was exhausted. Every time he offered to take care of her mother's medical expenses, Grace dodged the subject. At night, she still sorted hospital bills at her desk, checked bank balances, called the clinic for itemized statements. She wrote everything down in careful notes, paid bills on schedule, clung to the fragile belief that things were still under control. But Landon noticed the smallest changes. He noticed she was sleeping later, that she sometimes skipped meals, that she stared at the pages of her book without reading a word. So quietly he stepped in, not to take everything from her shoulders, but to remind her she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. One evening, while she was scrolling through hospital expenses on her laptop, Landon placed a steaming mug of cocoa on the table. "You're still worrying about your mom's bills, aren't you?" Grace looked up, startled. "Were you eavesdropping?" "No, but I pay attention." He sat beside her, his voice gentle. "You don't need to bear this weight alone, Grace. I'm here. I don't want you to see me as dependent," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "No. You're the bravest woman I've ever met. And bravery also means knowing when to share the burden." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Landon opened a drawer and slid a folder toward her. "I spoke with a doctor at the Medical Research Center Helix Corps supports. There's a program for chronic heart patients, fully funded. Your mother qualifies. Most of the expenses will be covered. And the rest, let me take care of it." Grace stared at the folder, her throat tightening. "You've been arranging all this? Since when?" "Since the day you told me you wanted to quit work but were too afraid." "Because I was scared of being a burden." "And I was scared," Landon said, taking her hand firmly, "that you'd abandon your dream just because you thought you didn't deserve to dream." Within days, Evelyn was transferred to a new facility, better equipped, closer to home, with a staff that cared deeply. She never knew the full extent of what Landon had done, but she saw her daughter smile again. And that was enough. By late June, Grace officially left Brew and Bloom. Not because she was swept into Landon's glittering world, but because she finally had the freedom to live her own, to write. Every morning she sat on the balcony, the soft Seattle sun spilling over her notebook, as she poured her heart into unfinished stories. Memories of her mother, long nights at the cafe, the sound of rain tapping against windows, and the impossible journey from a proposal to pretend love to a life made real by love. Landon never intruded on her writing. He simply left tea or coffee beside her, sometimes a book for inspiration. And every evening when she closed her notebook, he was always the first to sit beside her and ask, "So, how far did you get today?" One quiet evening, curled up together on the couch, watching a documentary, Grace turned to him. "Do you think everything's moving too fast?" Landon set the remote down, meeting her eyes steadily. "No, I think it's moving at the right pace. Not the world's pace, our hearts." Grace smiled faintly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Your heart must be a great time manager." "Only since I met you," he whispered. But for Landon, no matter how deep his feelings ran, he knew emotions alone weren't enough. Grace deserved more than love. She deserved commitment. So he began to plan. Not fireworks, not roses falling from the sky, just a quiet dinner at their favorite restaurant, the place where they'd once shared their first meal without business hanging over them. He reserved an outdoor table overlooking the glittering skyline, candles, flickering piano music, floating softly in the background. Grace arrived in a simple cream dress, her hair swept back, her presence so gentle it made the whole evening slow down. Landon stood to pull out her chair, his eyes glowing with something both nervous and tender. They talked as usual, workbook small jokes Grace pulled from her current read. Everything felt ordinary until Landon suddenly rose. "I have something to say." Grace looked up, her brows knitting slightly. He took a deep breath, reaching inside his jacket for a small velvet box. "Grace Callahan," he said, voice trembling but strong. "The first time I met you, you were a stranger with a gentle smile in a crowded cafe. When I asked you to join me in the craziest plan of my life, I thought you'd just be part of a strategy. But you stepped in and shattered every definition I ever had of love." He lowered to one knee, opening the box. Inside glowed a sapphire ring, simple and timeless like twilight. "You made me laugh again, live again, dream again, and if you'll have me, I want to spend every chapter of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Grace's hands flew to her mouth. Tears blurred her eyes. Not from shock, but because her heart had been ready for this long before tonight. She nodded. "Yes, Landon, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms. Around them nearby, diners clapped softly, witnessing a moment that felt like a fairy tale come to life. Their wedding was not extravagant. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in a sunlit garden of an old villa on the outskirts of Snohomish. White ribbons hung across the branches of maple trees in their lush green season. Baby's breath flowers sat in simple glass jars, and wooden chairs were arranged in 2 neat rows, all facing a rustic archway woven with vines and wild flowers. Grace wore a simple white lace gown, no glittering jewels, no sweeping train. Yet, in Landon's eyes, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Her hair was pinned up softly, a few loose curls falling gently by her cheek, and her trembling smile as she walked toward him made his heart beat slow, as though trying to capture every single second. Landon chose a light gray-blue suit, simple and refined. No tie, only a boutonniere matching the bouquet in Grace's hand. A soft breeze stirred, lifting the lace of her dress and rustling the young leaves above them, as if nature itself was whispering its blessing. There were no reporters, no prestigious guest lists, no introductions of him as a CEO, no titles naming her the wife of a millionaire. There were only 2 real people, once wounded, once lonely, now standing together, looking into each other's eyes, as though every unexpected turn in their lives had led them to this very moment. In the front row on the left sat Evelyn Grace's mother in her wheelchair. Her hand clutched the bouquet on her lap as tears silently slipped down her cheeks while she watched her daughter smile radiantly at the altar. She had once feared Grace would spend her life struggling, too strong, too independent. But now she saw Grace had finally chosen someone who would never make her bear the weight alone. On the opposite side sat Marjorie Hale Landon's mother, leaving her shadowed home in Phoenix for the first time in years. Her hand gripped a handkerchief embroidered with Landon's name from when he was a boy. Her face remained composed, but her eyes were different. When Landon spoke his vows, she bowed her head slightly, as if offering both an unspoken apology and the fullest blessing she could give her son. When the moment came to exchange vows, their voices trembled, not from nerves, but from overwhelming emotion. Landon looked into Grace's eyes and promised, "I vow never to let you fight alone again. Not in the rain, not in the storms. From this day forward, every hardship will have 2 to face it, and every joy, we will share double." Grace held his hand, her tearful eyes steady and strong. "I promise to always remind you that the most beautiful things in life don't need reason. Only the heart, and my heart, chose you long ago." The entire garden grew still as they shared their first kiss as husband and wife. No thunderous applause, no swelling music, only the quiet stir of wind, the gentle tilt of flowers, and 2 mothers, both shedding tears because at last their children had found peace. Life after the wedding wasn't a picture-perfect fairy tale. It was a mix of tender moments and very real challenges. And that was exactly what made Landon and Grace's happiness feel more true than ever. They moved into a small vintage-style home in Seattle's Fremont district. Not a glass penthouse, not a sprawling mansion, just a cozy house with a wooden porch, a fireplace, and pots of greenery that Grace tended to every morning. Grace devoted more time to writing. The pages of her manuscript grew thicker each week. With Landon's quiet encouragement, she finally gathered the courage to send her first draft to a small publishing house in Portland. A month later, she received a reply. "We were deeply moved by the honesty and warmth in your voice. We would love to publish this work." Grace broke into tears as she finished reading the line. Not because her dream had come true, but because the man sitting across the breakfast table, with his coffee cup in hand and the same gentle look he'd worn since the day they met, had believed in her long before she believed in herself. The book, Latte Days and Rainy Nights, was published to glowing reviews. In the dedication she wrote simply, "For the one who walked into my life as a role, but stayed as my destiny." Helix Core continued to thrive under Landon's leadership, but this time he wasn't working to fill an emptiness. He worked with passion, yes, but he went home for love. They built simple rituals together, cooking dinner each night, though Landon still managed to burn toast, and Grace teased him as the CEO who fails in the kitchen. They always laughed, turning every meal into a 5-star moment. Friday evenings became their tradition of reading side by side. Grace with her novels, Landon with his research papers, always ending with a passage they'd discuss in quiet awe. One year after their wedding, on a misty morning, Grace laid a pregnancy test on the kitchen counter. Landon looked at it silent for a few seconds, then pulled her into his arms, his face pressed against her shoulder. "Really?" She nodded. No words followed. They just held each other, crying softly, the tears of new life. When Lily Grace Hale was born, she carried her father's gray-blue eyes, her mother's warm smile, and something else that made them believe everything they had endured, from that first deceptive dinner to the confession of love, had led to this moment. Landon, the man who once claimed he had no time for love, became the most devoted father, an expert at changing diapers, reading bedtime stories, and whispering tales about a man who once didn't believe in love, until he walked into a small cafe on a rainy Seattle day. On weekends, the three of them visited the old bookstore Grace once frequented. Little Lily darted between the shelves, while her parents sat together on a wooden bench reading the same book. No rush, no pressure, just together. And that was the ending they hadn't planned for. Not perfect, but exactly what they needed: a modest home, a small family, and a love that had begun as a performance but endured through patience and understanding. A love that was real. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about love is that it never arrives the way we imagine it will. Landon once believed happiness had to be planned, calculated, optimized like an algorithm. He didn't trust chance. He certainly didn't believe that a noisy cafe could ever be the beginning of a great love story. And Grace, she never dreamed of stepping into the world of men like Landon. She only dreamed of making it through each day, of having enough strength to care for her mother, of being brave enough to write down the words she carried in her heart. Love, if it ever came, she thought would be quiet, slow, never in the form of a stranger's outlandish offer to pretend to love. Yet it was precisely from the unexpected, the imperfect, the foolish beginnings that something real took root. They didn't love each other because they came from the same world. They didn't love each other because of plans or appearances. They loved because when they looked at one another, they saw the better version of themselves. A CEO who once lived in isolation and a woman who once lived day to day in survival. Together, they built a home, not grand but filled with laughter, not glamorous but filled with kindness. And if you've ever doubted whether love born from pretense can ever last forever, then their story offers the softest, truest answer. Real love doesn't begin from where you stand. It begins in the way you choose to take a step toward the other. One honest step, then another, until the role play isn't needed anymore. Because in the end, you've truly stayed.